Hey everybody, so time to get started. Put the games away, or wrap it up. We'll wait a minute. All right. So today we're going to talk about some advanced hybrid topics. Yesterday, I don't know how many people were in the session yesterday for hybrid, but we talked about hybrid fundamentals, what's coming with hybrid. Now we're going to talk about some of the more advanced topics. Today we have a slightly different cast member on stage with me. I'm Tim. I'm from the supportability team. I should be more specific since there's a couple Tims on stage at the moment. So I'm Tim Heaney. I'm from the supportability team. I work on Exchange Hybrid. It's my main focus area, Exchange Hybrid and migration. And
I'm Tim Thomason. I work in America's Cloud Services Group, and we're responsible for a lot of Office 365 and cloud deployments. A lot of my focus the last 2 years has been on complex hybrid deployments, mainly with multi-forest, multi-exchange orgs. So,
cool. And unlike yesterday when I had SharePoint shirts to give away, today I actually have Exchange shirts to give away. So,
yay!
We got the right product. So today we're just going to jump right into it. I'm not going to go through fundamentals of hybrid. If you need fundamentals of hybrid, I suggest you go outside the room, watch yesterday's video, and then come back in and we'll be good to go. All right, so spacebar is working very slowly. So again, here we are, the TIMs. Advanced Exchange Hybrid Topologies. Like I said, we're going to jump right into it. So some of the things we get asked are, what are the best deployment practices, right? And these customers have Exchange 2010 on premises, and they're saying, how do I go hybrid? I want to install a hybrid server. With Exchange, there's no such thing as a hybrid server, okay? There is a mailbox server, a CAS server, and a hub server. Or if you're on more recent versions of Exchange, there's a mailbox server and a CAS server, right? There is no hybrid server role, right? It's just a set of features that runs, right? It's a wizard that runs. So when people say hybrid server, you shouldn't think of it as a hybrid server. It is a CAS and mailbox server, a CAS, mailbox, and hub server. Transport people might get mad at me if I leave hub out. So it's CAS, transport, and mailbox server. So don't think of your Exchange servers as, don't think of your hybrid servers as separate from Exchange. When you're deploying Exchange, you should always deploy Exchange properly. So if you were going from, say, 2010, you want to go hybrid, you have 10, Exchange CAS servers rolling, you're properly sized, or you think you're properly sized for your environment. Should you introduce 2013 to go hybrid? Well, the answer is it really depends, right? And we talked about this yesterday, so I'm going to go through this very quickly and take you right to the simple answer. The simple answer is if you need 2013 or 2016 features, then yes, you should deploy 2013 or 2016. So how do you know if you need 2013 or 2016 features? Well, do you need cross-premises e-discovery? Well, then you should deploy 2013 or 2016. Do you have archive mailboxes in the cloud? Okay. If you have archive mailboxes in the cloud and you want to do MRM retention for those mailboxes, you can have archive mailboxes in the cloud on 2010 hybrid. But if you want to do MRM retention, automatic retention for the items so that they go to the archive mailbox automatically, then sure, you need Exchange 2013. Okay. If you need any of the advanced mail flow options that we introduced in 2013, then yes, you need 2013. But outside of that, most customers don't need those things, so they could stay on 2010. You could cause more problems going to a newer version if you were to deploy incorrectly, okay? So if you don't have a need, stay on 2010, do your hybrid, set up hybrid, move all your mailboxes. 3 months later, you're in the cloud. 6 months later, 12 months later, whatever it is. A couple months later, you're in the cloud, okay? So just to illustrate this a little bit, this is the way you might have yourself configured now. You have your workstations, your Outlook, your mobile devices, all connecting to Exchange 2010. Then one of our awesome salesmen at Microsoft comes in and says, you know what you need? You need the cloud, right? And based on a session I did yesterday with the rest of the supportability folks, all 3 of you have signed up for the cloud. Anyway, it was staggering numbers in that session. For anybody who was in there, they know what I'm talking about. So you have everything connected. You have everything connected for 2010. Like I said, you're properly sized. Then you go to the cloud. Well, then you say, okay, well, we need to do MRS, to move the mailboxes. So one of the biggest loads we have when you move to the cloud is, one of the biggest hits on performance we have when going to the cloud is MRS, migrating your mailboxes, right? So when you're migrating your mailboxes, if you have a properly sized set of Exchange 2010 servers and they're managing all your client connectivity and all the activity that you have going on-prem right now, your migrations will probably go okay. We have 20 concurrent moves at a time by default. You can up it to 100 if you want. But we have 20 concurrent moves. Most likely, if you're properly sized, you'll be able to handle that, especially if you do it late in the day, over weekends, things like that. Then once you start moving mailboxes, additional things start hitting your client access servers, okay? The additional things are free busy requests, mail flow, different things like that start happening once you start moving those mailboxes to the cloud. But if you think about it, when you move a mailbox from Exchange 2010 to the cloud, you then take away all of that traffic that used to come from client connectivity and all the disk resources that used to be used to connect to the on-premises environment. So do you think you have more traffic on a CAS server from client connectivity or more from people trying to schedule meetings and having that small little meeting request come across? It's going to be minimal amount of traffic. So you're probably sized properly, and your on-premises performance is probably going to be awesome the more you move your mailboxes to the cloud, right? So this is what I would say. If you don't have a need for features in Exchange 2013 and your goal is to get to the cloud, you don't want to move mailboxes to 2013, then don't do it, okay? Get yourself to the cloud. Don't do 2 migrations just for the sake of saying, 2013 looks cool. I don't like the orange, so I want the blue one for a couple months. If your goal is to get to the cloud, then don't do it. Now, if you have different goals, then do it. If your goal is to stay in hybrid, many customers want to stay in hybrid for very good reason, okay? Then maybe you should go to 2013 and 2016 when it's available. Maybe that is the approach you should take, but don't think you have to, okay? So anyway, this is just to illustrate what would happen if you said, well, let me just put one 2013 server out there. Well, if you put a 2013 server out there, the way to do it properly, to deploy 2013 properly, is to say, I want all my external access to come through. All my external endpoints should point to the newest version of Exchange. That's the way we recommend doing it. That's the way we support deploying 2013 in your environment, right? So if you do that and you have all these 2010 servers, now you deploy 1 or 2 2013 servers and point all your external traffic to that, what's going to happen? Good Lord, I hope there's some big servers, right? So don't do it, right? Don't do it. If you're going to deploy 2013, that's fine. I'm not against deploying 2013. I'm not anti-2013, right? If you're going to deploy 2013, my message here is do it properly. Size it properly. Get enough 2013 servers. Don't deploy one and think, oh, I'll do that. It'll be great. It's not going to be great. The other one is, well, what if I get sneaky on you and deploy a separate namespace? So I'm going to point all my external URLs to 2013 to 2010, and then I'm going to have a hybrid.contoso.com that points to 2013, and I'm going to get all tricky with you and mess with the org relationships and all this stuff, okay? Don't do it. You're just adding complexity for no reason. If you need 2013, deploy it correctly. If you don't, okay? The challenge here is, let's say you do this. You're a consultant. You say, well, my goal is to get out of this customer site as quickly as possible, right? So sure, you could do this for the customer. What happens in a month when they rerun HCW? If they need to rerun HCW. We overwrite the org relationship settings. So now they have to have a policy written to go in and update settings manually to support this thing that you just did to your customer, okay? Deploy it correctly. That's the point, the message I'm trying to get across. Yeah, and don't do that. That's why there's a red X on the screen. So quickly, does the guidance change for 2016? So if you look at the scenario here, we change the scenario a little bit. All your on-prem servers are 2013 now. So let's say you have all these 2013 servers. I'm dying out here. Oh. Microphone died out. So let's say you have all these 2013 servers, and you say, I want to introduce 2016. Our story is actually better now, right? I don't know, how many people were in Ross's session the other day? Okay, so a good portion. So now when you when you have 2013 servers, if you want to introduce a 2016 server, you can actually introduce it to the same pool, meaning your external URLs for like mail.company.com, if it hits a 2013 or a 2016 server, it doesn't matter. Okay, it will proxy perfectly fine. So now we don't require you, like when you jump from 2010 to 2013, you have to have a properly sized 2013 environment to handle that proxying. We don't require that anymore. Okay, when you jump to 2016, you could say, well, I'm going to try one server, toss it in there, see how it goes. Okay, if it hits that server, it'll proxy fine. Your client connectivity, your federated request, all that stuff will just work. Okay, so the deployment options here are. You could just toss a server in there and start incrementing 2016 into the fold. It's a lot cleaner. The reason is the proxy architecture hasn't changed, so it'll just work seamlessly. Sizing guidance. I'm going to go through sizing guidance pretty quickly. Sizing guidance. You should use normal, CAS, hub, and mailbox sizing guidance, or CAS and mailbox, depending on the version you're using of Exchange, okay? Trying not to exclude 2010 here. So you should use proper sizing guidance. Now, when I say proper sizing guidance, how many people use the calculator? Okay. How many people have seen the hybrid section that's in the calculator? It doesn't exist.
It's being looked at. It's being looked at.
What's that?
It's going to be looked at now, I think.
It's going to be looked at, but it doesn't exist.
There, right?
I was just curious. So people are seeing, what calculator are you using? No. Hold on. Somebody over here raised their hand. You did? Yeah. Congratulations. You're the first one to see this. Pass that back. Yeah. They didn't give me the Canon. All right, so anyway, wow, I was not expecting that. Sorry for the delay in action. Back to the presentation. All right, so you should use normal CAS, hub, mailbox guidance. And if you think about what I just talked about on the previous slide, right? When I said when you introduce 2013 into the environment, it's for a very similar reason, right? You don't want to just throw one server because it's not going to be sized properly, right? But if you have an environment, enough CAS servers, enough mailbox servers to work with your on-premises deployment, as you move mailboxes to the cloud, the dependency becomes less on-premises, right? So at the end of the day, if you were sized properly for the number of users you had, then you're going to be sized properly for hybrid, okay? The only time it becomes a burden, more of a burden on-premises, is if during migration time, okay? During migration time, we do tend to take more bandwidth because we're moving and disk utilization and things like that on your Exchange server. So you want to be mindful when you're doing migrations to make sure the concurrent moves you're doing, if I want to do 20 at a time, 10 at a time, 5 at a time, 100 at a time, I'm making sure I'm not inundating my system. I'm doing it at the right times of the day. I'm doing it over the holidays. I'm doing it over the weekends, those types of things. So just be mindful of that. But use regular guidance or use the calculator that he has access to. Hybrid's not a rule. I already talked about that. I just talked about that as well. How is your mail flow configured? So as people move a ton of mailboxes to the cloud, sometimes they don't have very many left or none left on premises at all, right? Then they think, well, I can get rid of almost all my servers because I only need it for recipient management purposes. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but I only need it for that. So I can get rid of all of my servers. But they don't realize that they have CMT configured, centralized mail transport, or whatever we renamed it recently, CMC. Some CM acronym for centralized mail control that it's pointing the MX record to on-premises. Well, if you have all your mail flow going through on-premises, you may have more demand on those servers. So obviously, there are caveats to this. So you have to know about your own configuration and make sure that you don't just keep one server if you have centralized mail configured, because that might cause a problem. It might make Scott Landry upset. Migration traffic is more taxing. If anybody doesn't understand that during a migration it's going to be more taxing, just come to me later. We'll talk. And he'll talk more about that later too, I believe. So, can I have a separate set of servers for migration? Yes, you can have a separate set of servers for migration. So you don't want to mess with your proxying and redirecting and all that stuff. That's why we don't suggest using a separate namespace for like auto-discover and client connectivity and FreeBusy and all that stuff. Don't mess with your proxy redirect functionality that you already have configured in Exchange, okay? But for a migration, when you're performing a migration, you could say, I want to use, it'll auto-discover the endpoint, but you can say, I want to use a specific endpoint, okay? You might be using your mailboxes from, moving your mailboxes from EMEA, or you might be moving your mail, and the endpoint might, for auto-discover might point to the US. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So you can put in a specific URL to migrate from X endpoint. It also allows you to separate that load that your servers might not be sized for so that you can have velocity migrations, okay? So that's the one instance where you can have a separate set of servers for a hybrid purpose. It's not for hybrid connectivity or features, it's for hybrid mailbox moves, okay? Yeah, and this goes through those points. So, moving on, the purple slide. Hybrid decom story. So people all the time come up and say, I've moved all my mailboxes to the cloud, or I plan to move all my mailboxes to the cloud. Now I want to get away from hybrid. I want to, it's awesome. Office 365 is awesome. And basically, this is how the story goes. The customer hears the benefits of Exchange Online, like all of you over the past 3 MECs or Ignites or whatever the heck conferences you've been going to, okay? So you go through the conferences and you hear, oh, Exchange Online is our future. We have to do it, right? The account teams enlighten them that you don't have to do it all at once, though. You can go in and you could do hybrid, and hybrid is a superstar, right? So then the customer deploys, and they could do it over a cup of coffee because you've heard about the wizard, right? Then, they comprehend the awesomeness of Office 365. They're following that yellow brick road. They might even have one of those bikes that was at the last MEC, right? All right, so now they realize the benefits, but soon they realize there's no way out of hybrid. So, what do? Well, they call support, or worse, they go it alone and try to get out of hybrid, okay? When I say there's no way out of hybrid, what am I really saying? You can get out of hybrid, right? If you moved all your mailboxes, we don't need the Federation Trust, the org relationship, so on and so forth anymore, okay? But what we do need is recipient management, okay? If you have DirSync enabled, activated, it has nothing to do with Exchange at this point. If you have DirSync activated and you have synchronized users, okay, we lock out not all, but 90+% of the Exchange attributes in the cloud from being modified in the cloud. Because we want things to be in sync, right? So you have to modify them from on-premises. So if you get rid of Exchange, what's going to happen? If you get rid of Exchange, now how are you going to manage your users? So you need to create a new mailbox. Well, that's easy. You go to ADSI Edit, you mess with the MSEXCH remote recipient type value, you pop in 5432, right? Boom, you got yourself a mailbox, right? Oh, you need a proxy address? Let me crack open ADSI Edit. People say, well, why don't you create a management tool for Exchange? I think that's a great idea. We call it the Exchange Admin Center. We have it. It's there. We're not going to recreate a tool. So the idea now is you have to keep an Exchange server on premises. You can get rid of the hybrid configuration. We have a document. I don't know if you guys know about it, the TechNet document out there now on how to get rid of the hybrid configuration. I'm going to cover it really quickly on these slides. But there's a TechNet document. You're not going to remember steps, so don't worry about the steps on the slide. They're in the TechNet document. And it tells you how to get rid of Exchange completely, if you want to decommission DirSync, if you want to turn off DirSync, and it tells you how to get rid of your hybrid configuration, but keep Exchange if you want to keep DirSync enabled. So why do people care about DirSync so much, right? And I say DirSync, there's somebody in the audience that's probably going to kill me for not saying AAD sync, so I apologize. When I say DirSync, I'm going to replace AAD sync, okay?
Or AAD sync connect, yeah. There's the other one coming.
Should I go connect or sync? AAD sync connect. So anyway, the challenge is that the real problem is identity, right? The problem is identity. You most likely had DirSync and deployed hybrid because you wanted to have single sign-on to some extent, either ADFS or Identity Federation or password sync, one or the other, right? After you move all your mailboxes to the cloud, was Exchange the only, how many people Exchange is the only service you use? Oh, so you have other applications? You don't have any other applications. You just use Exchange. So they don't use anything else. Okay. Can you, I've never. This is. Yeah. This is. Andreas, you mind passing this back to him? All right. There you go. So. Congratulations. All right. So. Man, I lost my train of thought. So anyway, people need a single username and password in both on-premises and Office 365, right? So you need DirSync enabled to make that happen, right? Whether it's ADFS or password sync, DirSync has to be enabled. AAD sync, AAD connect has to be enabled. Directory synchronization has to be activated for that, okay? If it's activated, you need something to manage on-premises. That's why you need this, okay? So it's an identity thing, okay? It's like Michael Jackson. Cool. There's the document link I was talking about. You're going to get access to the deck, so you'll be able to click that link if you're too lazy to search in Bing. Again, I'm going to speed through this because I just talked about this. So when would you want to get rid of Exchange? So we'll do it the other way. When do you need Exchange and hybrid? When do you need Exchange only for recipient management? And when do you not need anything? Okay? So if you have on-premises public folders, if you need the ability to offboard, if you have secure mail relay configured, if you have mailboxes still on premise, and I'm not talking about system mailboxes, I'm talking about user mailboxes, okay? And if you have any of those scenarios, basically where you need Exchange still on premises, then keep Exchange in hybrid. If you're using those services, you need both, okay? You can get rid of the hybrid configuration and keep an Exchange for recipient management purposes, essentially if you keep directory synchronization activated. This goes over what I just talked about, right? Why would you do that? You don't keep directory synchronization activated because it's fun. You keep it activated because of identity, most likely. If anybody has any other reasons, it's great. Let's talk at the booth later because we'll be there. Removing both would be an option if you said, okay, I moved all my mailboxes. I don't know what your name is, but you removed all your mailboxes, right? You moved all your mailboxes to the cloud. You have no need for identity anymore, right? Because that's all you use, right? So you'd be good to go. So that asterisk is for you. All right, and I'm just going to speed through. These go through the steps of if you want to leave Exchange but remove hybrid. If you look at the steps that we're actually doing, the only real difference is going to be in the last two steps. This one says, this is where you need to Exchange server for recipient management, okay? This one is basically, I'm going to remove most Exchange servers, okay? So you remove org relationship, intra-org connectors, yada, yada, yada. But the difference between this one and removing Exchange and hybrid is I'm removing most, but not all Exchange servers, okay? If you only need recipient management, you can have 2 underpowered virtual machines doing recipient management. You don't need these powerhouse servers, okay? You can have a SAN if you want, but there's really no reason. The other one, if you remove Exchange and hybrid, the big difference is you would be removing DirSync. You would be deactivating DirSync, directory synchronization, at some point. So you'd remove all of your Exchange servers and deactivate directory synchronization if you were doing a complete, I'm done with on-prem, I don't need password sync, I don't need ADFS. How many people think they would ever be in that state where they don't need password sync or ADFS? Why is your hand not up? I am so confused. Please come to the booth later. Okay. I did not see any hands, so that's why I saw one. If you get into that state? If you follow your own steps for removing Exchange and hybrid, no, you can't go back. But if you follow our steps, you'll absolutely be able to go back. I should say I can't guarantee you'll be able to go back if you use your steps. But if you use our steps, it's essentially just rerunning HCW. We do not put you in a state where reactivating DirSync and rerun HCW. There might be a little work involved, but you can definitely go back.
Having said that, if you remove the last Exchange server, your org is gone from on-prem. So keep that in mind. Can you repeat the question?
So I heard the question. There is a remove hybrid configuration commandlet. It's actually available in 2013 and 2016. So let me go through this. So the Exchange 2013 has a remove hybrid configuration commandlet, and Exchange 2016 also has that commandlet. Okay, Exchange 2010 does not. The wonderful thing about the remove hybrid configuration commandlet is that it does not remove your hybrid configuration. So if you want us to backport that, I could make an argument. It won't pass, and it would do you zero good. So what it does is it removes your desired state. When you answer questions in the wizard, HCW, you say, I want centralized mail, I want this certificate, blah, 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 right? It's more important than that, so not blah, blah, blah. Those things, okay? You answer those things. We store those in Active Directory, okay? We store those in Active Directory, then we run a commandlet called update hybrid configuration, which pulls those settings, and then runs the appropriate commandlets to configure your desired state. Remove hybrid configuration removes the answers that you provided. Does not remove any of the configurations that we did. So it's a useless, it's not a super useful commandlet for removing a hybrid configuration. So I would say, no, we're not going to bring that to 2010. But I'll take that feedback. All right. Time that. Yeah. So I can't hear you that well, so I'm going to move on, and we'll talk later. All right. OAuth and federation. I don't want to derail too much either, so we'll answer a few questions, but we're not going to go crazy with questions in here. OAuth and federation. Why OAuth? We talked about this a little bit yesterday. We'll talk about it a little bit today, too. Why OAuth? People need OAuth for a few reasons. If you're 21 ViaNet, anybody on 21 ViaNet?
What's the one?
So it's in the Greater China region. They have some more strict code of conduct. So they're in their own space basically. And we needed a hybrid configuration for 21 ViaNet customers in the Greater China region. So that is what one of the things that you need OAuth for, because they can't use the Microsoft Federation Gateway. They have to have a separation basically. Now, the other reasons to deploy, and that's not super high demand right now. The other reasons to deploy, the main reasons for the people in the room would be cross-premises discovery and cross-premises MRM. Okay, so if you have MRM archive mailboxes, you want to do automatic retention, that's the real reasons to go OAuth. Now, if you're a 2013 native customer, we send you through OAuth anyway. You go through the OAuth configuration wizard in happy days, right? If OAuth is configured, we'll actually use that for FreeBusy as well. We'll use that for any cross-premises, we'll use that for most cross-premises features. So OAuth, if configured, isn't just used for discovery and MRM purposes, but if configured is used for FreeBusy and other things as well. Okay, so, and it's the long-term approach we're taking. So we have DAuth and OAuth. DAuth is what we use today, the Microsoft Federation Gateway. You've probably heard it called that. Sorry, blinding. Everybody put your shades on. Super bright slide. So anyway, so DAuth is what we used before, Microsoft Federation Gateway. And when you set up your Federation Trust, we use the DAuth experience. We're moving towards the OAuth experience, 2013. SP1 was when we introduced the OAuth experience. It was actually introduced a little sooner, but you weren't able to configure it. There's a lot of similarities between them, but basically, if you think of DAuth and OAuth and compare them, we have the Microsoft Federation Gateway and the org relationships for DAuth. So you use the Microsoft Federation Gateway for your authorization, to get your authorization tokens, and use your org relationship to say, this is how I'm going to connect to the other environment to see FreeBusy information. Great. For OAuth, the story changes a little bit, and we now have an authorization server, which basically takes the place of the Microsoft Federation Gateway. And we have this thing called intra-organization connectors, which takes essentially the place of org relationships. Are they the same thing? Not exactly. If you compare the two, when you look at the settings, now there's more settings I kind of limited what you see on the intra-organization connector side, but I wanted to show you the feature-by-feature settings here. If you do get organization relationship, you'll see there's FreeBusy settings, there's mail tip settings, there's OA settings, blah, blah, blah. If you do get inter-organization connector, it's enabled or it's not. So what we've done is we've taken all the options away from you. You're either going to be hybrid or you're not going to be hybrid, okay? The idea is if you go hybrid, you should be trusting the organization. You should share your FreeBusy between them. It should be considered one environment, okay? So if you're a customer that had, the reason I mention this, if you're a customer that had, I only want to share FreeBusy, I don't want to share mail tips, right? Or I only want to share FreeBusy, limited details, something like that, set up on an organization relationship. And then you go through OAuth, what's going to happen? All of a sudden, all those limitations you had in org relationships, gone, okay? We don't use them. And OAuth is preferred. When the availability service requests FreeBusy information, OAuth is the first step. If we don't find an intra-organization connector, then it's look for org relationship. So those restrictions will not apply, okay? How do you configure it? Well, we have a wizard for you. We're the wizard team. That's what we do. So at the end of the HCW, if you're 2013 native, we have a wizard that shows up for configuring OAuth. So if you have 2013 only in your environment and newer, that comes up. If you have 2010 or 2007 in your environment, how many people have 2010 or 7 in their environment? Of course, right? So if you have that, we've left you in the dust. You have to use the manual steps to configure OAuth. You can still configure it though. Again, most people don't need it, but you can configure it. You need it if you need cross-premises discovery and cross-premises MRM. Okay? What's that? FreeBusy will work without OAuth. FreeBusy works today without OAuth. It'll work the way it always has, through org relationships and Microsoft Federation Gateway Trust.
Are there ways, are you planning to bring more granular controls back?
There's nothing on the roadmap for that. I would like your feedback on that later, though. So if you come down to the booth later, I'll be there right after this session. And so to configure OAuth, we talked about the prerequisites for configuring OAuth, so I'm going to move on. To cover briefly how FreeBusy works with the Microsoft Federation Gateway, aka the old way. Basically, Ben would request FreeBusy for Joe. Joe's in the cloud, right? So the client access server is going to say, that's a remote user. What's the target address for that user? It's going to be joe@mail.contoso.allmicrosoft.com, okay? So we're going to go and say, okay, is there an org relationship that has a domain name of mail.contoso.allmicrosoft.com? We're going to find that there is an org relationship with that domain name. So we're going to say, okay, I want to go to the trust broker, Microsoft Federation Gateway, to get a delegation token. So we say, hey, give me a delegation token that's valid for mail.contoso.allmicrosoft.com. Trust broker comes back and says, here's your delegation token. Delegation token, along with the SOAP request, goes over to the Office 365 Exchange servers, and the FreeBusy is returned. Okay? That's the way it works with the Microsoft Federation Gateway. We look at the org relationship to determine where we're going to get the authorization token from. Then we look to the org relationship again to determine the endpoint for the opposing organization so that we can send the token we got back along with the FreeBusy request. Then Joe's happy as a clam and sees that FreeBusy request. So how does it work with OAuth? Okay, same thing. Ben's requesting Joe's FreeBusy information. Once Ben requests Joe's FreeBusy information, the CAS server now does a slightly different lookup. It first looks for a thing called an intra-organization connector. It says, what's the domain names listed on the intra-organization connector? It sees the target address for Joe's mailbox is on one of the domain names. So contoso.mail.allmicrosoft.com. Mail.contoso.allmicrosoft.com is one of the domain names. So then it goes, instead of to the Microsoft Federation Gateway, it goes to the authorization server that's specified for the organization. Authorization server is stored in Azure Active Directory. Okay? So now, instead of going to wherever we kept the Microsoft Federation Gateway servers, I don't know who knows where that is, right? We now have basically local instances of Azure Active Directory everywhere, right? In all the data centers. So now you're probably going to a local data center or a somewhat local data center to get your OAuth authorization endpoint token. You get the token back. So Windows Azure Active Directory returns the delegation token. And then we send a request for FreeBusy to a SOAP request for FreeBusy along with the authorization token to the Exchange server, and we get the information back, and he sees FreeBusy. Moral of the story is, what moved here? The authorization server. That's what moved. Okay? We have a much more resilient authorization server that's deployed in Azure Active Directory, that's deployed in all of our data centers. So it's much more resilient, it's much better, it's much more robust, and it's also in line with what all of our authorization options are. We're using modern auth, we're doing all these things to get towards OAuth, so it gets us to a more standard compliant approach. Microsoft Federation Gateway, I have a red X on it. Probably shouldn't have put a red X. It's not going away anytime soon, okay? But the point I'm trying to make here is that we are moving towards OAuth. So if you have OAuth configured, we're not using the Microsoft Federation Gateway. But don't think that Federation Gateway is going away anytime soon. We know there's a reliance on it, so we're not getting rid of it. If you're interested, the availability service does checks in this order. On 2016 and 2013, it will request FreeBusy locally first. The user is not local. It will look to an intra-organization connector. If there's a domain name, intra-organization connector with your domain name, we're going to use that. Okay? If that fails for some reason, you can't talk to the auth server, you screwed up a setting, we screwed up a setting, whatever it is, if it doesn't work, as soon as we find an intra-org connector, we're not going to fall back to the third one. We're done. Okay? So if it fails, if it's broken, we're not going to say, I'll use deauth for org relationships for a fallback option. It doesn't work that way. Okay? The third option, if there is no intra-organization connector with the target address domain on it, we will then use org relationships, and then we'll use the availability address space. Okay? Slightly more detail. I'm running a little short on time, which is fine, but slightly more detail on this is OAuth request. For OAuth requests, again, is Bill is requesting FreeBusy from Ted, which is typically, some people got that reference. Can you give me a shirt? Because he's laughing at my reference. If you want a shirt, you got to be in the front row and laugh, and then I'm happy. Okay. What's that? That's E for excellent. You were in yesterday's session. So Bill requests FreeBusy from Ted, which is typically an EWS or similar type call, right? So Bill says, I'm going to request FreeBusy from Ted. Why do I say EWS or similar type call? He could be using OA, he could be using a different client, whatever. But he's requesting FreeBusy from Ted. It hits the on-premises Exchange server. Once it hits the on-premises Exchange server, the availability service determines that we have an intra-organization connector matching the target domain. So then it's going to use something called a discovery endpoint. If you look at the intra-organization connector configuration, you get intra-organization connector, you'll see there's a target address domain in there, a discovery endpoint in there. We use that discovery endpoint to try to discover and retrieve an authorization token. It's actually called a bearer token. So once we do that, actually, I should talk about one of the interesting facts there. The discovery endpoint there, when we try to, we go get the authorization token. Once we get the authorization token, we then hit the auto-discover endpoint with that authorization token. When we hit the auto-discover endpoint, we're getting a service-specific token. We're not getting a user-specific token, okay? So this service-specific token, this authorization endpoint gave us a delegation token that's valid for a service. So when we send that token to the on-premises, to the Exchange Online server saying, hey, I want FreeBusy, right, or the opposing server saying, hey, I want FreeBusy, the auto-discover response we get back from that request, well, it's not going to be a user-specific auto-discover response because this bearer token doesn't know it was created for Ted, Bill, Jane, John. It doesn't know, okay? It's a service-specific token. So the response we get back is actually a system mailbox. And you may ask, which system mailbox? That's easy. It's the one that has the grammar persisted capability. So has anybody ever looked at the system mailbox and said, show me persisted capabilities? You have things like the OAB persisted capability, things like that. If you don't run the command, you'll see it. There's a persisted capability of grammar. Why we picked grammar? I don't know. Okay? But that's what we use today. We're going to get an auto-discovery response back from wherever the grammar the mailbox from the server that has a system mailbox with the grammar persisted capability. We'll then get that EWS response back, send the request, FreeBusy response comes back, you get your FreeBusy information. Okay? I'm not going to go through a bunch of these slides. I'm actually going to skip through them pretty quickly. I'm not even going to cover them. A lot of these are reference slides. We have a few issues that we've seen with OAuth, And a lot of people say, how do you troubleshoot OAuth? I have a bunch of command lists that we run. These are the command lists that we run from on-premises, and this is just for reference, okay? So you're going to have these slides. You'll be able to copy this transcript, paste it into your PowerShell, and collect your information, okay? These are the command lists that we typically connect from the online shell and MSO shell, okay? This is just trying to share information. When we have somebody calls in the support, this is the type of data we try to collect, okay? This gives you all the information you need to determine what's going on with OAuth most of the time. It'll give you most of the information you need. And then I have slides, and I'm not going to go through each of them because of time constraints, but I have them in there for reference for you all so that you can see like when OAuth is enabled, what to do if you have a missing accepted domain, what causes 401 issues for customers. Again, because of time, I'm not going to go through them all, but there's about 15 slides in here of problems you would run into with OAuth. I had no intention of covering them in here. I wanted them to be reference material for you, okay? And I would probably bore you to death anyway. So what I'm going to do now is hand it over to Tim, once I get his slide queued up.
You're going to cover, this.
I'm going to hand it over to Tim. Okay, anyway, the other Tim. All right, so...
Quick.
What's that?
I think if we go through this quick.
Yeah, we'll go through this real quick. A lot of the scenarios that Tim's going to cover, I'm confusing everybody with all the Tim talk. So we'll call him Tim, we'll call me Timothy, okay? No. What Tim Thompson's going to cover, a lot of it is multi-forest type stuff, right? He's going to show you the real world, show you about customer deployment, show you what's going on there. To give you a little preface on what you need for multi-forest, we have this diagram that kind of talks about what you need to configure. One of the things I will plug is that we actually have AAD sync that now makes this process a lot easier. And I'm going to get to that point, and then I'll talk about that. So basically, before you set up anything, you want to make sure you have your forest trust set up on premises the way you normally would. You'd want to make sure that you have mail flow working between your on-premises forest, your two forests on premises, right? Make sure you have mail flow configured, make sure everything's solid there. The HCW is not meant to configure mail flow between the two on-premises forests, right? So the assumption is that if you have secure mail between your on-premises forests, that's configured, right? So make sure you have two properly working on-premises forests, okay? The hybrid wizard is not going to fix everything for you. Now, the most complicated thing with multi-forest deployments, I say multi-forest and people are leaving the room. Oh, no. Anyway, the most complicated thing with multi-forest is DIR sync, okay? AAD sync, AAD connect, FIM, okay? FIM is the most complicated thing, and before, up till very recently, your solution was FIM. Your solution, if you had a multi-forest deployment, was to have FIM, go through our mess of content to try to figure out how to deploy this thing for multi-forest hybrid. And then I think even 2 people actually did it successfully. Not sure how. Made it through. I'm sure things didn't work correctly, right? You needed, we coined it as you needed a FIMologist to be able to configure FIM for multi-forest. And we have some guidance out there. We had some guidance out there. We still have some guidance out there, but it's super complicated. It's really hard. And if you're an Exchange admin, you're probably not that well versed in FIM, okay? So you'd have to get external folks or other folks to help with the deployment, and maybe that's how some of you made money. I don't know. Sorry if you made money that way, because we're about to make it a lot easier, okay? But you'll find other ways to make money. There's a lot of ways to do it. So AAD sync. AAD sync is what we're moving towards. I think everybody's heard about this. Everybody knows we're going towards AAD sync, AAD connect, okay? This has the ability to do multi-forest hybrid built right into it. And right now we have a TAP program going on, and we want people to join this if you have a need for multi-forest, right? Don't add the complexity if you don't need it just to join a TAP program because it sounds cool. But if you have a need for multi-forest, join a TAP program. If you go to our hybrid multi-forest content, we actually have a link that takes you to an email address. There's like 4 people on that email address, and 2 of them are in this room, okay? We want people to sign up for multi-forest if they need it. We want to validate this thing. We want to help you get to that configuration. So join it, join it, join it. But anyway, this is the hardest part. AAD sync is going to make this a lot easier. You should expect a ton of improvements in this area over the coming weeks. Then the next thing you do is run the hybrid configuration wizard. We've done a lot of improvements into the hybrid configuration wizard to support multi-forest. If you think about before we had org relationships, and the org relationship was called on-premises to Office 365 org relationship in Exchange 2010. That's what we called them, okay? You might have noticed that we now call them on-premises to Office 365 with a big long GUID, okay? Why did we do that? We did that because we needed unique names for our org relationships for multi-forest. Those changes were specific for multi-forest. We did similar things with our connector namespace, okay? We needed unique namespaces for multi-forest, so that's why we added a GUID to the end of it. All these enhancements came in Exchange 2013 SP1. So we need to be running at least Exchange 2013 SP1, and you should obviously be running CU7 or CU8, okay, to take part in the multi-forest hybrid deployments. Configure ADFS. Obviously, you don't have to configure ADFS for this, but it's, at this point, many customers will configure ADFS. You could have ADFS in one forest or multiple forests, depending on the trust relationships you have. If you have a full two-way trust, you can have ADFS in one forest, and it could authenticate both sides. But that's up to you. There's a bunch of different complex ADFS deployments. It's not what this session is about. And configure your org relationships. When I say configure your org relationships, what I'm talking about there is the hybrid configuration wizard will configure your org relationships between your on-premises and your cloud environment. So if you run it from org A, HCW will configure that. You run it from org B, HCW will configure that. What it will not configure is the org relationships from org A to org B, so the two on-premises orgs. So if you need a FreeBSD relationship there, you need to set up your own org relationships. And we don't do OAuth between on-premises organizations, so it would have to be Federation Gateway and org relationships. Can I use AAD Sync? Yes. Join a tab. We want you. Okay. You could also use AAD Connect if we want to call it that today. We can call it whatever we want. Just don't use DirSync. We don't have that support for multi-forest with DirSync. If you use FIM, is it supported? Technically, it's supported with best effort. But FIM has always been supported with best effort. FIM is one of those things where it's, if your FIMologist is really good, we're going to try to help them. We don't hang up the phone on anybody, right? And if you got me, man, that's probably out of my league, right? Because he's able to configure the darn thing. So, but yes, we'll help. But it's not, we won't write bug fixes for FIM. We're gonna be doing full-blown support for AAD Sync. If you use FIM, it's supported with best effort. Golden rules for hybrid, the multi-forest hybrid deployment. This kind of says it in a few different, it goes through the iterations of it in a few different ways, but basically there's a few golden rules that I like to keep in mind. Auto-discover, you need a separate, unique auto-discover endpoint for each forest, okay? So for the cloud, that's going to be the auto-discover endpoint for mail.contoso.allmicrosoft.com, your routing address. For the on-premises organization, if you have two on-prem organizations, it should be contoso.com and fabricam.com, okay? You can't have two forests that have contoso.com as the routing address for auto-discover, okay? If you do that, you need to have at least a unique namespace for target addressing. It would break your mail flow, it would break your FreeBSD flow, so you have to have a unique auto-discover endpoint and target address for each of your forests, okay? The other golden rule that, obviously Service Pack 1 or later, all that stuff, the other golden rule is around naming your user names, okay? When you synchronize your users from on-premises to the cloud, they're all going to be stamped with a contoso.mail.allmicrosoft.com address, and you can't have conflicts, okay? So one of the things we recommend is that you, for your target addressing in your email address policies, you make sure that you have a unique routing name. So what some people do is, let's say you have tim@contoso.com and tim@fabricam.com. Oh, was it there?
Yeah, I put the slide up.
Ah, there you go. So let's say you have tim@contoso.com and tim@fabricam.com. You can't have two tim@contoso.mail.allmicrosoft.com. So to keep them unique, you need to make sure that the routing address is stamped, the email address policy is stamping something that keeps them unique. Okay? The way we suggest you keep them unique is to have something like the forest name in there. So for just that name, it's a routing domain, who cares, right? So it's tim.contoso@. And then people think your last name is Contoso, and that's kind of cool. So, Trusts are not transitive. We talked about that in yesterday's session, so I'm not going to go through that again. So now I'm going to skip ahead to notes from the field. And I'm really going to pass it to Tim V2.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. So, I mean, up to this point, a lot of what we talked about is really around the technical details. How do you configure things? What should you do? How does it all work? What we really wanted to do now is share with you some of the information basically from us deploying it in the field with our customers, the more complex customers and sort of deployments we've had, predominantly around multi-org hybrid. But multi-org hybrid doesn't necessarily mean you have to fit that category to be complex. You could be single and you can have a lot of nuances that go on with identity, compliance, a lot of other things that come into play. So here and the next couple of slides, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the multi-org customer engagements. It's just a bit of a small sample of what we've done. And the example here is multinational customer with 3 AD forests, 3 exchange orgs, their account forests and resource forests. They had an existing gal sync between the environments, so they had some coexistence between each of them. They could, there was mail flow and other kinds of things, as well as your gal lookup. The configuration here was fairly straightforward, but we used FIM. The difference was we had to use a custom attribute. So we used the custom attribute 16 to synchronize to the immutable ID. I don't want to get too deep in identity, but the point of the slide, and I'm coming to it, is really around identity makes all of this work for a multi-org, right? It is really the foundation and the plumbing, the glue that brings it all together. Government customer, 3 AD forests, 3 exchange orgs. They actually had a custom FIM portal. So what Tim was talking about before, you want to go into ADSI and edit directly and all of that kind of crazy stuff, they did it. So they had it for various reasons. It's linked into their HR system and other things in internal management. So they directly wrote to AD. So when we deployed a separate server for FIM with the AD sync connector on it, or MA, I should say. So we had custom attribute flows and account joins between forests. This can get very, very complex very quickly with FIM. It's one of the reasons why we encourage you to move to AD sync. There's a lot more control and capability built into the tool. With FIM, it becomes very complex when you have contacts represented in one forest. You need to join to users in another, and all of those kind of complexities. They also had a lot of mail-enabled applications and centralized transport, which in a couple of slides I'll get to briefly, can introduce another complexity when we're talking about multi-org hybrid exchange. Another government customer, 7 AD forests, 6 exchange orgs. You can see we're more and more. We have some that are much, much larger than this that we've done. But this is just a bit of a sample of what we've worked on with different customers. And the key point is none of them, no 2 customers are the same. The nuances are different between each customer. You can have the same challenges. You may be able to do initial synchronization setup out of the box, but then you have to look at flows between the environments, the forest. Are the customer going to decommission a forest? Are they going to move mailboxes between exchange organizations? All of those sorts of things. So where do most of the challenges come from? As Tim talked about earlier, the other Tim, it is identity, and I said it earlier in this slide, it is the foundation and the glue that will make multi-org hybrid work. Don't underestimate the effort. Whether you need a femologist, as Tim's kind of coined a word term here, or basically you need someone with identity to sit and assess with the customer's environment, do the planning, do it up front, look at your short-term goals. Yes, you want to get mailboxes there tomorrow, but look strategically down the road. What are you going to do when you decommission? As Tim said, how are you going to provision users? All of those sorts of things you need to consider. The time you spend up front will save you troubleshooting or having to re-architect in 6 months. So next couple of slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of multi-org customers, specifically one, which was a government customer with 3 AD forests and 3 exchange orgs. So we can see we have org A, B, and C, exchange 2010 and 2007. Each of the forests had user accounts in each of the environments. And they had the existing FIM 2010 server, as I mentioned, and they actually had trusts in place. Not everyone had it. You may or may not need them, depending on how you're going to do your authentication. And we deployed a separate FIM instance, as I talked about earlier on, with ADFS actually deployed in the org A. And the reason for this is the security principle associated with the mailbox was actually from organization A. So all of the users in org B and C, when their mailboxes are moved to the cloud, we actually flipped the security principle. Instead of using the account there, we used the corresponding account they actually said it had in org A for authentication. So ADFS was deployed there and did the authentication. That's just one example of an architecture that could be deployed, and depending on your customers' requirements, what they're going to do down the road, there are other ways of approaching this. You could very well have leveraged the identity in each other forests and allowed ADFS to authenticate against them, passing through authentication if you had trust set up. Another possible way. Again, back to the previous slide, this can be complex. It can be straightforward, and you really want to plan it out with your customer and try to keep it as simple as possible, though. Don't over-engineer it. Don't, if you can make it easy, in this case, they're looking at consolidating Active Directory. It was easier for them to take this approach. So, next couple of slides, I'm going to talk, or this one, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the environment complexities of these customers. Namespace, we've alluded to a little bit earlier regarding if you're dropping in 2013 and do you alternate namespace, you don't really want to go there. However, when you start looking at auto-discover and your namespaces, some customers don't publish that. How do you handle that? Those are things you've got to look at. Some government customers or very security-conscious corporate customers, they don't want to expose anything on the internet. They don't. You have to come in through a VPN in order to access anything. How do you configure this when you're going to hybrid? You have to expose some things publicly. So you have to look at that approach, look at what they're going to be speaking to security and everyone else and having those discussions, probably back and forth with security, to try and make it work. Alt-ID is something I believe was talked about in the session yesterday. This customer actually implemented a form of Alt-ID already, and they really wanted to go this way with Office 365. They had 96-something odd domains and departments, and they already actually had challenges with this. So they had a separate UPN, separate primary SMTP address, and SIP address. We managed to talk them out of this to standardize on using a single address for the UPN and primary address and SIP, and it's worked out a lot better. They had tried some earlier testing where they actually caused them a lot of pain and grief. So if you can possibly avoid it, when you start looking at identity, I know I'm coming back to it again, but when you start looking at it, plan for it. See if you can look at is it an opportunity to clean up your AD? And when you prepare for identity, you've got to look at not just conflicts that might happen within a single AD forest and syncing to the cloud, syncing to Azure AD. You've got to look at all of your AD forests. Some of those tools out there won't actually look at duplicates across forests. That'll happen in your synchronization tool. CMT, we talked about that in a couple of slides back, but if you have centralized mail transport, you have to plan for that as well. There are implications in a multi-org hybrid, and I'll talk about it more on the next slide. Compliance is another big one. If you have a customer that is heavy compliance requirements for some legal reason, maybe they need to look at keeping all of their data tracked all the way through. Now, you're moving a mailbox to the cloud. How are you going to do that? If you're on Exchange 2010 or higher, one thing you can do is set litigation hold on the mailbox prior to moving it. What that means is now when you get it to the cloud, it's honored in the cloud, and there's no potential for something to be deleted. Otherwise, technically, if you move a mailbox to the cloud, a user could go in, they could manipulate some content, delete some content, and you could be in breach of your compliance requirements and regulations. So just one aspect of things to look at planning for. Provisioning, We kind of talked about this already, but what do you do when you're looking at decommissioning your Exchange environment? But even if you're not decommissioning and you're maintaining it going forward, how are you going to provision? Are you going to use a hybrid server you keep in place? Are you going to leverage some other tools a customer may have? With multi-org forests, you're looking at synchronizing the identity. So even if you do a command that calls and enables a remote mailbox, that needs to be synchronized to the cloud in order to provision the mailbox and then set a license. If you have a scenario where you have a customer that has contractors coming in this morning, they've got to have a mailbox to work, you may not be able to wait the default 3 hours or whatever that interval is going to be if you have even more forests coming into sync to propagate that to the cloud. Maybe that's an opportunity. Maybe you need to look at using that hybrid server you keep on-prem for staging. Provision there with a back-end process to move to the cloud. Just something to consider. And we've run into all of these things, and we see it all the time. Most of this gets exponentially more complex with multi-org hybrid, but it does apply to some single org hybrid environments as well. Message encryption. If your customers are using message encryption, some devices on-prem in your mail flow today, how are you going to handle that when you get to the cloud? If you are not transitioning to Office message encryption in the cloud yet, maybe that's a long-term strategy you're going to use, you're probably going to have to use CMT and route your mail back on-prem with the appropriate header or whatever you're using to get tagged by your on-prem encryption.
I got a question. How many people notice an error on the slide? There you go.
What do we got?
Oh, no. Message encryption.
Oh.
Well, I wanted to call out the elephant in the room. All right, continue on.
Calendar sharing. This is an interesting one that we see a lot. Cross-premise calendar sharing. It is supported read-only. It is not full delegates. It does not mean you can open a calendar and edit it. What it does mean is if you have the calendar's default permissions set correctly in the corresponding mailbox, a user in the other on-premise environment or the cloud environment can open and read it. It's the only way you can enable it. However, one of the conditions or considerations rather to it, when you set it to be enabled and the permission to reviewer, and now other people in the cloud can see your on-prem or vice versa. Just bear in mind your CIO's Friday golf appointment is going to turn up to the whole organization. You cannot limit that to per user. When you open it up, it becomes exposed to everyone. So again, more things to consider. MRS and load balancing, try not to do it. It's better to really have multiple MRS namespaces and map them directly. You can make it work with load balancers, but one of the issues that can come up, and actually got it in the next slide, but I'll talk about it now. MRS process puts a lock on the source mailbox as it tries to move. If you have an issue and the load balancer does not maintain a connection, something happens, there's a period of time, roughly about 20 minutes, it'll eventually time out. But if it tries to restart in the meantime, it's still locked to that mailbox. After that timeout period, it will be allowed to reconnect if it's being the load balancer, F5, Kemp, whatever you're using, directs the request to an alternate MRS server. It'll eventually accept that request, create it on that MRS server, and start. It's not a graceful restart. If you're at 85%, before this flip over happened, you're starting at 0 again. You're migrating thousands of mailboxes and you have something misconfigured in your load balancers, you can imagine the impact on that. You could be wasting possibly 50% of your window for migrations.
To be fair, one of the where this is a bigger issue is if you're migrating from Exchange 2010, migrating from Exchange 2013. Because the MRS has moved, because the protocol heads are moved to the mailbox server, it becomes less of an issue. That's why we don't have affinity requirements for Exchange 2013. But most people are coming from 2010. A lot of people, not most, but a lot of people are coming from 2010.
Attachments, another thing that we see. I know we've increased the limit to 150 megs for MRS moves. The limits are still different depending on whether you're looking at EWS or doing a IMAP migration. They looked at being standardized, but this wasn't actually the big fix that everyone, it's fixed a lot of issues we commonly see, but we still have customers that have larger than 150 megs. One customer I've worked with had size of the largest I've seen to date is, I think, 700 to 800 megabyte files, and a department of about 1,200 of them. And the reason for that, this happened to be a bit of a library. What?
I was going to give you a shirt.
Attachment size?
I was going to give you a shirt.
No. So, I mean, who here has file attachment issues still, even though we've got the 150 meg limit for MRS now? I mean, what's, anyone? Yeah, in the back?
The back.
What's the largest size that you've hit? What was that? How much? I can't hear that.
1.25 gigs. You
Oh, wow,
should,
really? Well, he wins, I think he wins a t-shirt for that.
I can't throw that far.
Well, that's the biggest I've seen. So that's probably
Since you
like
saved a little money on a
it's
shirt,
a
you
HD
should,
version of the Avatar or something. For
since you
some
saved some money
legitimate
on a
reason
shirt,
to be
you should
emailed.
go ahead and buy yourself a DVD.
So sometimes there are legitimate reasons where these file sizes have been there. Why they've ended up in mailboxes, people try to email those, I don't know. But nonetheless, you still hit them. Network is another one, and in how you look at your network environment. If your customer wants to do funny things such as asynchronous routing, maybe they want to look at having an ingress point and an egress point out a different way. In theory, it works. However, we've found things such as mailbox moves in particular become susceptible to that and issues. So also as you migrate, you're going to start consuming more bandwidth. And Tim talked about it briefly, but you're offloading some of your load from on-prem. But now your users need connectivity. They need that bandwidth to connect to the cloud. So at some point during your migration, your overall capacity is going to be reduced for migrations. You're not going to have 200 megabytes per second available anymore. You might be losing 50%, 70% of that now to just connectivity traffic from your users. Something to bear in mind as you plan schedules and you try to migrate. Virtualization, really this is just here to ensure, just as something to call out. We've seen it with some customers where they virtualized, they've configured dynamic memory and other things on their servers, MRS server gets put under load, and we couldn't work out why we're getting good performance. Turned out they had dynamic memory on and allocated something like 4 gigs of memory to a 2013 hybrid server and trying to run 100 concurrent moves through it, and it didn't work. And apparently their 2010 mailboxes were also the same. Follow our best recommended guidance. In this case, it's actually our supported guidance. So, mailbox move complexities. I know we're starting to run low on time here. Multiple MRS servers we've talked about. Maintenance activities. The other Tim briefly mentioned, but try to plan around your mailbox moves around those activities, backups, antivirus scans, any of those sorts of things. Sometimes on-prem e-discovery and journaling, there's processing that can happen in the background as well. Pre-migration process, this is really things such as, it lines up with e-discovery, is there anything you need to do beforehand? Maybe you're going to trim the data. Maybe you're going to enforce some retention rules to reduce your mailbox size. Maybe part of this is you're going to consider looking at our drive shipping options. Looking at that process, or you're disabling and then re-enabling after you move to the cloud. Parallel migrations for multiple Exchange organizations. Tim briefly talked on that too, that if you have multiple orgs moving at the same time, you've now got MRS servers in different environments, your tenant has a default limit of 100 concurrent connections in a single tenant. So you may find you're going to have to configure those endpoints for each environment to balance that request out. If you set 100 in one, you won't be able to move anything in another. Now, if you have the demand and the justification, you can request through support to have the limit increased, and they will assess it on a case-by-case basis. And it can be raised. if you can justify it.
Just so you know, the requirements when you call support to be able to get that increased is typically just saying please.
Yeah. Depending on who you get. Sometimes you get to provide a little more information, but yes.
How far in advance do you have to call?
Pardon me?
How far in advance do you have to call?
Generally, it takes a couple of days for the request to actually be processed. So the question was, how far in advance do you have to call? And by the time you submit the request, it gets assessed. It's usually about 72 hours is typically what I've found for it to be implemented. Plan ahead, much further ahead. I mean, you should be doing it in the planning stages anyway. Now, batch mailbox sizes, if you're submitting batch mailboxes in large sizes, 1,200 users at a time, that kind of thing, one thing to keep in mind, and we hit with some migrations here, is if you submit them with an auto start capability, one of the things that will actually happen is it will go through and validate each mailbox through that batch file before it starts moving a single bit of data. So I've personally seen 8 to 10 hour waits on like a 1,200 mailbox batch. And if you've got a short window, you're losing a lot of time before you actually start pulling any data across. The fix for this is you actually submit it without the auto start parameter and do a start on the batch afterwards, and it will start actually copying data on the first mailbox after it's validated. So if you're doing batch sizes, seeing performance issues, it's sitting queuing for a long time, that's one of the reasons. Archive data rehydration. What this is about is really if your customer has a lot of archive data. I mean, who here has customers that archive on-prem to Symantec, Vault, Commvault? I mean, there's a lot of hands here. So this is going to be something that all of you are going to be faced with moving to the cloud. This is not a multi-org issue. This is just a mailbox move and hybrid issue. You have to restore that data. Maybe you're natively restoring into Exchange. You have to look at the performance hit of your Exchange servers and storage capacity when you rehydrate. Maybe you want to look at drive shipping. Maybe you want to look at another option, going directly to Exchange Online archives instead. Or drive shipping, which is another option that we've started to provide as well. So, I've seen, for example, where you look at an average mailbox that's 2 gig in size, suddenly we're looking at an average of 6 or 8 once we rehydrate data in, depending on what your customer's policies are for archiving in the first place. If you're going to take all that to the cloud, your plan of 6-month migration or 9-month migration might turn out to be 5 years. And then you've got to weigh up how do you do it. And a lot of the time, if there's a compliance requirement, they simply can't cut the data. But they may be able to cut the data cord and say, from point in time, we're going to look at this for on-prem e-discovery and compliance, and from here to the cloud, and rather than pull all the data. Again, things to consider, and they add to complexities of your move. Source database health. Pretty obvious one, and source server resources. That's kind of a little bit linked back to my virtualization one. But those are things to consider. You can set up 100 MRS servers if you want. You can put as many resources on them. But if you're targeting 2 or 3 mailbox servers and you're targeting them during business hours and you've got 80% utilization, you're going to keel the server over. So it's something to consider. E-discovery and archive, I think we talked about. I think we're running
a minute.
Yeah. I'll just very quickly here go through this last couple of slides here because it's going to have to be very quick. But this particular customer, this government one again, they actually did centralized mail transport and they had iron port. So the mail flow, initially, they had flowing with connectors between each environment. Pretty standard, outbound. SMTP was going to iron port from each of the environments. And inbound hit iron port to each of the Exchange orgs. In a hybrid state, one of the challenges is with CMT, once you enable it, yeah, your inter-org, the mail flow between each org is still the same. And yeah, that's fine. You have now your hybrid connectors to each environment. But the moment you actually CMT or CMC enable one of your hybrid orgs, all mail flow is going to go through the connector to that org. It will disregard anything on the other two orgs. That can be a problem. You need to make sure your on-premise organization is configured to allow relaying those messages, either by configuring the connectors or adding the address space as an additional accepted domain.
So
Relay
I
domain.
want to jump in real fast. There's no way he's going to be able to cover this scenario the way it should be covered because we're running out of time here. So we're going to be, obviously we'll stay back a few minutes after the session like normal, but we'll also be down at the Exchange booth downstairs right after this session. So if you want to go through this, he's happy to whiteboard it with you. I just want to thank everybody for coming and enjoy your lunch.